You are 12 years old. A man, a stranger, is standing across from you at a church door. You have never spoken to him. You do not know his name. And yet, within the hour, he will own you. Legally. Spiritually. Completely. This was not a punishment. This was not a war. This was a Tuesday in the Middle Ages, and it was called a wedding. Before this video ends, you will learn that on the night that followed a ceremony like this one, strangers, family members, wedding guests, sometimes clergy, could remain in the room to formally witness the legal completion of the union, because the law required a witness to confirm it. You will learn that the blood-stained bed sheet was sometimes examined the next morning and displayed as legal proof of a bride's virginity. You will learn that a husband held what church canon law called the marital debt, the legally recognized right to demand physical intimacy from his wife, a right she had no canonical authority to refuse. And you will learn that in parts of medieval Europe, the feudal lord of an estate claimed the right to spend the first night with a peasant bride before her own husband ever touched her. Each of those facts is documented. Each of them was ordinary. But none of them is the most disturbing thing this script will show you. That comes at the end, when we look at the church's own rules governing when a married couple was permitted to be intimate, and exactly how little those rules protected the woman inside the marriage. The architecture of control built around medieval women was not crude. It was meticulous. And it was built by the most powerful institutions in the Western world. Stay with me. Because the history of medieval marriage is not a romance. It is a blueprint. We want to imagine it a certain way. Two young people across a field, catching each other's eye. A father who sees their happiness and blesses it. Flowers braided into hair. A choice made freely, from the heart. Cut that image away. Cut it slowly, the way a knife moves through something soft. The smell of a betrothal negotiation in a common household was tallow candles and wet wool and animals kept too close. It happened in farmhouses with earthen floors, beside pig pens and grain stores, in the presence of men who were calculating the value of a daughter against the weight of a debt. Betrothal was not a romantic moment. It was a legal instrument. A contract negotiated between fathers, sometimes between families who had never broken bread together, in which a daughter's hand was exchanged for land access, livestock, seed grain, the forgiveness of a debt owed, or the acquisition of one. A girl could be formally promised in betrothal as young as 7 years old. The marriage itself would typically wait until the church's minimum threshold, 12 for girls, 14 for boys. These ages were not protections born of compassion. They were ceilings of delay, reluctant concessions by the church to biological reality. Below them, the transaction was premature. At them, it was valid. The dowry system worked like this. The bride's family transferred wealth to the groom's household as part of the exchange. The bride price, in older Germanic and Norse traditions, ran the opposite direction. The groom's family paid the brides for the acquisition. Both mechanisms said the same thing. The bride herself was the unit of value being transferred, not a person entering a contract. An asset being collateralized. If a family attempted to break a betrothal, the consequences fell heavily. The dowry could be forfeited. Ecclesiastical courts, the medieval equivalent of civil litigation, could be invoked. The family's reputation suffered damage that echoed across multiple generations of marriageability. A girl whose betrothal had been broken was a girl whose value had been questioned. In communities where a woman's worth was defined entirely by her marital prospects, that question could close every door permanently. She knew all of this. The 12-year-old standing in the farmhouse while the men negotiated knew it the way she knew the weight of the water bucket, not as abstraction, but as the physical fact of her life. She did not rage against it, most of the time. She did not weep dramatically in the corner. She stood, and she waited, and she understood that this moment was not about her. It had never been about her. Candlelight. Stone arches. Sacred vows whispered between two people who chose each other beneath the vault of something holy. That is what we see when we close our eyes and imagine a medieval wedding. We see beauty. We see meaning. The ceremony happened outside. Medieval marriage in the Catholic tradition was conducted in facie ecclesiae, at the face of the church, at the church door, in full public view. This was not a romantic choice. It was a legal one. Marriage was a public transaction, witnessed by the community, because the community served as the living record of its occurrence. There were no municipal registries. There were no certificates that would survive a flood or a fire. The witnesses were the archive. The village remembered because the village had seen. The sensory reality of that door, the weather, whatever it was. The crowd of unwashed bodies pressing close, smelling of tallow and labor. In a rural village, the sounds of livestock nearby, geese, pigs, cattle, competing with the priest's words. The couple did not stand in a sanctuary of elevated silence. They stood in the world, fully surrounded by it. In many noble marriages, where the stakes of the arrangement were too high to risk any emotional complications, the groom had never seen his bride's face before the ceremony. The veil was not a romantic tradition. It was a contractual mechanism. It prevented the groom from rejecting the bride after laying eyes on her but before the vows were spoken. Once the words were exchanged, once the contract was sealed in language, the deal was made. Then, and only then, was the veil lifted. If he was disappointed by what he saw, he had already bound himself. The bride stood to the groom's left. That positioning, preserved in modern ceremonies as meaningless tradition, carried specific medieval meaning. She stood on his sword arm's weaker side, the side from which a man draws slightly slower, the side that symbolized she was under his protection and, simultaneously, under his control. Both things were true simultaneously. Protection and control were not opposites in medieval marriage. They were the same offer. The ring placed on the fourth finger derived from the Roman belief in the vena amoris, the vein of love connecting that finger directly to the heart. But in medieval practice, the ring was not primarily a symbol of love. It was a mark of claim. The woman had been taken. The ring told every other man so, the moment they glanced at her hand. Now look at the man standing beside the groom. The best man. In the earliest medieval tradition, his role was not to hold the ring. He was an armed guard. He carried a weapon. He was there to prevent the bride from fleeing, to defend against rival families who might arrive to disrupt the ceremony or seize the bride for themselves, and to physically enforce the completion of the ceremony if resistance emerged. There is a sword at this wedding. Let that image sit for a moment. There is a sword at a wedding, and its purpose is to make sure the bride does not leave. Watch the moment when the father places his daughter's hand into the groom's. She has no legal personhood in this moment. She is passing from one man's property register to another's. Her body, her labor, her future children, her voice in the management of her own life, all of it crosses the threshold with that handover. The priest says words. The community watches. It is legal. It is sacred. It is complete. After the ceremony, the couple, finally alone. Behind a closed door. That is what we assume. That is almost universally what modern people, even those who know medieval history is dark, still unconsciously assume. The wedding night, whatever its complications, was at least private. It was not private. Across much of medieval Europe, the newlyweds were escorted to their bedchamber by the wedding guests in a ritual historians call the bedding ceremony. The bed was sometimes blessed by a priest before the couple entered it. Guests sang bawdy songs through the journey up the stairs or across the courtyard. In some documented practices, they helped undress the couple. Witnesses gathered in or near the room, remaining until evidence of consummation was established. In Iceland, records indicate that at least 6 witnesses were required to observe the bedding for the marriage to be considered legally valid. Not suggested. Required. In parts of Germany, the assembled guests gathered outside the chamber while drums and pipes played loudly enough to be heard at a distance, which historians read as both communal celebration and social enforcement. The noise was a kind of wall that made the room both public and observed, even without direct witness. In Scotland, legal tradition recognized what was called marriage by cohabitation with habit and repute, meaning that couples who lived publicly together, and were known by their community as husband and wife, could be legally considered married even without a formal ceremony. The bedding ceremony, in this context, was both symbolically and socially powerful. It announced to everyone present that this couple was now beginning a shared life. The threshold for what counted as witnessed was low. The requirement for witness was not. In royal and high noble households, the stakes of the bedding ceremony were not personal, they were dynastic. The legitimacy of future heirs depended on confirmed consummation, and the political stability of entire kingdoms rested on that legitimacy. When a queen's firstborn son would inherit a crown, the question of who had been in that room mattered enormously to everyone who would one day be governed by the child. The bedding ceremony in these households was not a prurient tradition. It was a constitutional act. The following morning brought what historians refer to, with careful restraint, as the virginity examination. The bed linens were inspected. Blood was considered legal proof of the bride's prior innocence, evidence that what had been promised had, in fact, been delivered. In documented cases, the sheet was examined by senior family members. In more extreme recorded instances, it was displayed to the wedding party. What this meant in practice was that an absence of blood, which medically could indicate any number of things entirely unrelated to prior sexual experience, had only one interpretation available to the community. There was no forensic nuance. There was only the judgment of people who had been awake since before dawn and were not inclined toward charity. The consequence of that judgment, annulment, return of the dowry, or its forfeiture, depending on who was deemed at fault, exile from the family, loss of any future marriage prospects, public shaming that followed the woman like a shadow through the rest of her life. In some communities, documented records indicate physical violence. Then there is ius primi noctis, the claimed right of a feudal lord to spend the first night with a peasant bride before her own husband. This must be handled with care, because the historical debate around it is genuine and serious. No historian argues it was universal or uniformly practiced. What the historical record actually shows is more ambiguous, and in some ways, that ambiguity is its own kind of horror. There was a real medieval institution called the marchet, a fee paid to a lord for permission to marry. Some later historians read this as payment to waive a lord's sexual claim. Most modern scholars reject that reading. The marchet was almost certainly a labor management mechanism, the lord's way of controlling who left his lands and who stayed. No medieval legal document has ever been found that explicitly grants a lord the right to the first night. Historians today largely treat the ius primi noctis as a legal myth, powerful, widespread as a belief, and almost certainly weaponized as a tool of psychological domination even when no physical act occurred. What is documented is this: the belief was real, the fear was real, and the system of total feudal lordship over peasant bodies, their labor, their movement, their marriages, made the belief entirely plausible to the people who lived under it. The horror the ius primi noctis represents was real. Whether it was literally enacted matters less than what it reveals. In this world, a woman's body was not hers to protect. The Church built two structures simultaneously, and it built them in the same space. On one side, marriage as holy sacrament, the union of two souls before God, elevated above all earthly institutions. On the other side, a body of doctrine that rendered the woman within that sacrament legally and spiritually inferior to the man beside her. The vow of obedience was drawn directly from the letter of Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 5, verse 22, "Wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord." This verse was not ambient theology. It was embedded into the marriage ceremony itself across medieval Europe. The bride promised obedience. The groom promised protection. The asymmetry was not accidental. The husband held canonical authority. The wife held canonical duty. These were not symmetrical positions. They never pretended to be. The marital debt, debitum conjugale, was church law. A wife could not refuse her husband's request for physical intimacy. The doctrine framed this as mutual. The husband owed the wife the same consideration in theory. But enforcement was asymmetrical in practice. A wife who refused faced accusations of sin, of defying church teaching, of violating the sacramental compact she had made before God. A husband who refused faced little that was documented or enforced. The mutuality of the debt was theological fiction. The obligation it imposed on women was not. And then came the restrictions. The Church specified when married couples were permitted to be intimate, and the list of forbidden periods was long. Sundays, Thursdays, and Fridays were forbidden. Lent was forbidden. Advent was forbidden. The weeks before Pentecost and major feast days were forbidden. The 40 days following childbirth were forbidden, a provision rooted not in compassion for the woman who had just given birth but in purity doctrine treating her postpartum body as ritually unclean. Menstruation was forbidden. Breastfeeding was forbidden. Historians who have calculated the available days against the forbidden calendar find that the permitted window narrowed to a minority of the year. And within that window, the wife could not refuse. Hold that thought. The Church restricted access. And within those restrictions, it mandated compliance. Both simultaneously. Both enforced against the woman. The system produced an impossible narrowing, a space made smaller on all sides, and then required her to remain inside it without complaint. Divorce did not exist as a recognized concept. Annulment was available under a narrow set of specific conditions: consanguinity within prohibited degrees, prior binding religious vows, non-Christian status at the time of marriage, or non-consummation. A husband who beat his wife had none of these escape routes available to her. Church doctrine recognized what legal commentators of the period called moderate correction, the husband's right to physically discipline his wife, provided the correction did not become excessive. This was not a fringe reading. It appeared in church-adjacent legal commentary across Europe, from England to the Italian city-states. The question was not whether the husband could strike his wife. The question was only how hard. Ecclesiastical courts intervened in domestic violence only when it became scandalous enough to threaten public order. For most women, no threshold arrived. The Church was not a refuge. The Church was part of the architecture. In peasant life, marriage was a survival arrangement before it was anything else. A woman who married gained access to a household, a plot of arable land, a set of shared animals, the labor of a partner during harvest. These were not romantic benefits. They were the difference between eating and not eating, between having shelter when winter came and not having it. She also gained an owner. The work expected of a peasant wife was not supplementary to household life. It was the mechanism by which household life operated. Cooking over an open fire. Carrying water from the well or the river, sometimes long distances, multiple times each day. Spinning and weaving. Tending livestock. Assisting in the fields during harvest, when every available hand was needed and no distinction between men's work and women's work survived contact with necessity. Raising children. And then, when the children were old enough to be useful, beginning again. Childbearing itself was economic production. In a world where historians estimate that anywhere from a third to half of all children died before reaching adulthood, large families were not sentimentality. They were rational strategy. A child who survived to working age was a laborer. A son who survived was an heir. A daughter who survived was a future bride price, a future diplomatic asset, a future transfer of value to another household. Women were expected to produce children continuously, 5 pregnancies, 8 pregnancies, 12 pregnancies over the course of a marriage, while simultaneously performing every other function the household required. This was not seen as remarkable. This was the definition of a wife's function. This was what the contract meant. No trained physician attended a peasant woman in labor. Midwives operated on accumulated tradition and incomplete knowledge. Postpartum infection killed women before the fever fully announced itself. Hemorrhage killed women in hours. Obstructed labor killed women and the infants with them. The rates of maternal mortality in the medieval period were catastrophic by any modern comparison, and yet the expectation of another pregnancy resumed almost immediately after each birth, after the mandatory 40 days of church-mandated abstinence had passed, and sometimes before. The plainness of it is the horror. Women died from childbearing in large numbers, and the system responded by requiring more childbearing. Noble women were not spared this logic. They were simply placed inside a more visible version of it. Their marriages were diplomatic instruments, alliances between houses, seals on peace treaties, extensions of territorial ambition. A noble daughter's fertility was geopolitical. If she produced only daughters, she had failed her dynastic function. If she failed to produce a male heir at all, her position became precarious in ways that extended from the domestic to the political. Consider Queen Bertha of Holland and her husband King Philip I of France, in the late 11th century. Bertha had done what was asked of her. She had produced a male heir, the future Louis VI. But Philip had fallen into infatuation with Bertrade of Montfort, a woman already married to another man. He repudiated Bertha publicly in 1092, offering the humiliating explanation that she had grown too fat. The chronicler who recorded Philip's complaint noted the obvious irony. Philip himself was becoming so obese he could barely mount a horse. The real motive was personal desire dressed in the language of royal prerogative. He confined Bertha to a fortress on her dower lands, where she died 2 years later. He then married Bertrade, still technically married to another man, and defied excommunication to do it. Pope Urban II repeated the excommunication at the Council of Clermont in 1095. Philip ignored it for years. The Church's most severe spiritual sanction, separation from salvation itself, was a negotiable inconvenience when a king's personal desires were at stake. This is what the anecdote actually demonstrates. A woman could fulfill every expectation placed on her and still be discarded. The system protected the husband's prerogative. It did not protect her. Everything described so far, the Church's doctrine, the feudal economy, the bedding ceremony, the marital debt, existed within a larger structure. That structure had one defining feature: there was no exit. A woman who attempted to leave a marriage had nowhere to go. Her family of origin had, in most cases, already received the dowry or bride price. Taking her back meant returning the transaction. It meant reassuming an economic burden they had successfully transferred. It meant social acknowledgement that the deal had failed, and in communities where every family's reputation rested on the successful management of its daughters, that acknowledgement was devastating. If she returned, she was unmarriageable. An unmarriageable woman was economically unviable. The only institutional alternative was the convent, which required a separate dowry for entry, which meant it was available only to families with sufficient resources to fund a second transaction. For a peasant woman, it was simply not a category that existed. The enforcement mechanisms were not primarily legal. They were communal, which made them more total. Gossip spread through village communities at the speed of shared wells and communal ovens. A woman accused of abandoning her husband, or of sexual irregularity, or of failing in her marital duties found herself excluded from the social fabric that made survival possible, refused work, denied access to shared resources, cut off from the networks of mutual aid that every medieval household depended on. Isolation in that world was not discomfort. It was a death sentence administered slowly. The architecture held because every part of it held every other part in place. The Church blocked the door with doctrine. The feudal system locked the window with economic dependency. The family had bolted the last exit before the wedding morning arrived. A woman was not trapped by accident or by the cruelty of any individual man, though individual cruelty was certainly present. She was trapped by design, by interlocking systems built by the most powerful institutions in Europe, systems that required her containment in order to function at all. So next time you watch a wedding, the couple standing together at an altar they chose, wearing clothes they selected, having written their own vows, the honeymoon booked months in advance, the private hotel room with a door that locks from the inside, the legal right to leave if the marriage becomes unbearable. Let yourself feel what is actually in that room. A father who handed his 12-year-old daughter to a stranger is not in that room. An armed man positioned at the altar to prevent the bride from fleeing is not in that room. Witnesses standing near a marriage bed, waiting for evidence, are not in that room. A sheet examined in the morning light is not in that room. A canonical law that removed a wife's right to refuse physical intimacy is not in that room. A church that recognized moderate correction and fell silent on abuse is not in that room. A feudal lord whose presumed claim to the first knight, myth or not, generated enough fear that an entire system of psychological dominance was built around it is not in that room. The woman who had nowhere to go, who had no one to return to, who had no convent that would take her without a second dowry she would never possess, she is not in that room either. Surface slowly. Breathe. And this must be said plainly, because history demands it. Within these systems, brutal, engineered, inescapable as they were, women found ways to live. They managed households with genuine competence and real authority. They wielded informal influence through alliances, through kinship networks, through the kind of intelligence that goes unrecorded because the records were kept by men. They found meaning in faith. The same institution that constrained them also gave some of them structure, community, and even, in the convents that were available to a fortunate few, something approaching intellectual freedom. They were not simply victims. They were human beings of full interiority, navigating the worst architecture their world had designed around them, and doing so with a resourcefulness that the historical record only partially captures. None of that makes the architecture acceptable. It simply makes the people inside it human. The legal right of a husband to physically discipline his wife, not as a fringe idea but as a mainstream legal commentary, survived in parts of European law into the 19th century. Some of the women living inside medieval marriage systems died less than 200 years before your great-great-grandparents were born. The distance is not as great as the stone and candlelight make it feel. What part of this history disturbed you most? The church's role in building and enforcing the system, the public bedding ceremony, the marital debt, or something else entirely? Tell me in the comments. I read them. If this kind of honest, unflinching history matters to you, hit the like button. Subscribe, because the next video goes somewhere equally unexpected, into a part of the medieval world that most people have never been shown. And share this with someone who still thinks the Middle Ages were romantic. The Middle Ages were many things. They were full of genuine beauty, genuine faith, genuine human love and all its stubborn insistence on surviving the conditions around it. But they were not a fairy tale. And the women who lived them deserve better than one.